You have been running. Perhaps you do not call it running. You call it prudence, or self-care, or knowing your limits. But I know what it is, because I have seen it in countless faces across a long life of observation. The flight from difficulty, the evasion of pain, the elaborate architecture of comfort-seeking dressed in reasonable clothes, and I know what it has cost you. The project abandoned when resistance arrived, the relationship dissolved when conflict demanded endurance. The potential left unrealized because realizing it would have required suffering you were unwilling to accept. You sense that something is wrong, that the life you are living is smaller than the life you were meant to live. You are correct. Something is wrong, but it is not what you suppose. The obstacle is not that you lack talent, or opportunity, or fortune's favor. The obstacle is that you have been systematically fleeing the very process that would develop your talent, create your opportunity, and prepare you to receive whatever fortune offers. Suffering is not life's unfortunate interruption, it is life's essential instructor. What I offer in these pages is not comfort. You have had too much of that already. I offer something far more valuable: the truth about how victory is actually won, and why everything you have been taught about pain is precisely wrong. The comfortable lie that ruins lives: there is a conspiracy abroad in the world, and you are its victim. I do not speak of political machinations or the schemes of foreign powers, though I have known plenty of those. I speak of something more insidious, a silent agreement among well-meaning people that ease is attainable, that difficulty indicates failure, and that the purpose of a life well lived is the steady minimization of discomfort. This is the comfortable lie, and it is ruining you. I have watched this lie work its destruction across 6 decades of public life. I have seen young men of extraordinary promise abandon their studies at the first frustration, convinced that education ought to feel pleasant. I have observed marriages dissolve at the first serious conflict, because the parties believed love should be effortless. I have witnessed enterprises fail because their founders expected success without setback. In each case, the pattern was identical. Suffering was interpreted as evidence that something had gone wrong, a signal to retreat rather than a price to be paid for advance. The lie had done its work. You must understand something essential. Your instinctive flight from pain is not natural wisdom. It is programming, cultural conditioning installed by a society that has confused comfort with happiness, ease with flourishing, the absence of difficulty with the presence of meaning. This programming serves you poorly. It is, in fact, the single greatest obstacle between you and everything you desire. Consider the phenomenon I observed most clearly in the 1930s. When I warned Parliament of Germany's rearmament, I was dismissed, not because my arguments lacked merit, but because accepting them would have required contemplating uncomfortable realities. Mr. Chamberlain returned from Munich waving his paper, and the crowds cheered. They wished to believe. The nation chose the suffering of willful blindness over the smaller suffering of facing truth. The comfortable lie whispered that peace could be purchased without price. And what was the result? We paid not less in suffering, but infinitely more, because we had refused the smaller payment when it was offered. This is the mathematics of the lie. Every discomfort avoided today returns multiplied tomorrow. The difficult conversation you postpone becomes the broken relationship. The discipline you evade becomes the squandered decade. The truth you refuse to face becomes the catastrophe you cannot escape. Comfort borrowed must be repaid with interest, and the rates are ruinous. But here is the peculiar thing. The lie is not told by villains. It is propagated by those who have themselves been deceived, which makes it all the more dangerous for being sincerely held. Your parents wished to spare you difficulty because they loved you. Your teachers softened the path because they meant well. Your culture promises ease because it believes ease is good. None of them understood that in protecting you from the forge, they were preventing your transformation into steel. The first step toward freedom is recognition. You must see the lie operating in your own mind. Catch yourself in the act of avoidance. Notice when you choose comfort over necessity. Observe when you construct elaborate justifications for fleeing what ought to be faced. This recognition will not be pleasant, but it is indispensable. The ground must be cleared before new growth can take root, and we have begun to clear it. What you flee creates what you fear now. We must examine what happens when the comfortable lie is believed, what actually occurs in the life of one who flees from difficulty rather than facing it. The answer is both simple and terrible. The suffering you avoid does not disappear. It compounds. Every difficulty you flee returns stronger, demanding more than it originally required. This is not philosophy. This is mechanics. I observed this truth most starkly in a young officer at the front during the Great War. He was a decent man, perhaps too decent. He could not bring himself to discipline his men. Each small failure to enforce standards seemed merciful at the time. Why create unnecessary discomfort? Why be harsh when kindness costs nothing? But the accumulated failures produced a unit without cohesion, without the habits of obedience that preserve life when shells begin to fall. And when the shells did fall, men died who should have lived. His flight from the small suffering of discipline created the vast suffering of preventable death. He carried those faces for the remainder of his life. That was the price of his kindness. You see, kindness which is not kind at all, merely comfortable. The mechanism operates identically in every domain of human endeavor. The student who avoids the suffering of rigorous study does not escape suffering. He ensures he will suffer far greater difficulties later, uneducated, unprepared, unequipped for the world he must navigate. The businessman who avoids the suffering of honest confrontation with partners does not preserve peace. He guarantees a larger explosion when the suppressed conflicts finally detonate. The husband who avoids difficult conversations with his wife does not protect his marriage. He slowly poisons it with accumulated unspoken truth. Think of it this way: difficulty paid early costs less than difficulty paid late. The skills required may be identical, but the price is radically different. Every moment of delay increases the debt. Interest accrues on postponed pain, and unlike financial interest, this interest compounds without limit. I learned this in my own life with brutal clarity. After Gallipoli, I faced a choice: accept the suffering of public disgrace and continue in the arena, or flee to private life and comfortable irrelevance. The second path would have spared immediate pain. But I understood, perhaps more through instinct than calculation, that fleeing the smaller suffering of 1915 would have created a larger suffering, the suffering of never having fulfilled the purpose I sensed awaiting me. Here is what you must grasp. Your recurring problems are not bad luck. They are not the cruelty of fate or the malice of circumstance. They are the compounded returns on difficulties you originally refused to face. Look at what keeps happening to you, the patterns that repeat despite your efforts to escape them. Now trace each pattern backward. You will find, at the origin of each, a smaller difficulty you avoided, a conversation you did not have, a discipline you did not maintain, a truth you did not face. This is not said to condemn you for past choices. That would be merely another form of avoidance, substituting self-criticism for action. The purpose is clarity, to see what is, so that you may act differently going forward. What you flee creates what you fear. Stop fleeing. The cold furnace produces no steel. If flight from difficulty produces such ruin, what then is the alternative? This question drives us to a truth so fundamental that everything else depends upon it. Suffering is not the enemy of achievement. It is the instrument of transformation. You have been fleeing the very process that would give you what you seek. Consider the blacksmith's forge. Raw iron enters and tempered steel emerges. But the transformation requires heat, intense, sustained, uncomfortable heat. The metal must suffer the flames, endure the hammer's repeated blows, submit to forces that threaten to destroy it. Without this suffering, there is no transformation. The cold furnace produces no steel. This is not metaphor. This is the mechanism by which all genuine capacity is developed. I have observed this truth in every domain of human excellence. The general whose composure never breaks under fire. Where did that composure come from? Not from peacetime parades. It was forged in previous crises, in moments when panic seemed reasonable and retreat seemed wise, moments he endured and thereby became capable of enduring more. The artist whose work moves nations, where did that depth come from? Not from pleasant afternoons of easy creation. It was forged in failures, in rejections, in the suffering of repeated inadequacy that slowly burned away everything except the essential gift. Nature herself testifies to this truth. The butterfly emerging from its cocoon provides perhaps the clearest illustration. A man observing this struggle, filled with misplaced compassion, once cut the cocoon to ease the creature's passage. The butterfly emerged. but it could not fly. Its wings remained shriveled and useless. You see, the struggle against the cocoon forces fluid into the wings. Without that suffering, the butterfly never develops the capacity for flight. The man's mercy was murder. Now, apply this understanding to yourself. When you wish you possessed a capacity you lack, greater discipline, deeper courage, more refined skill, ask this question: what suffering would develop this capacity? Your answer reveals not an obstacle to what you want, but the path toward it. There is no other path. The capacity you admire in others was forged in fires you would have fled. This does not mean all suffering is valuable. Random, purposeless suffering, the meaningless cruelty of accident or malice, refines nothing and serves no end. The furnace analogy requires intention. The blacksmith subjects metal to heat for a purpose, with a vision of what is being created. Suffering without purpose is mere damage, but suffering in pursuit of a worthy aim, suffering that is the cost of building something valuable, this has transmuting power. I prove this in my own flesh. After Gallipoli's catastrophe, after public disgrace, I might have retreated to comfortable irrelevance. Instead, I went to the trenches of the Western Front, commanding a battalion of the Royal Scots Fusiliers. There, amid mud and shells and the daily visitation of death, I found something I had not expected. Not happiness, certainly, but a strange peace and the restoration of capabilities I had feared destroyed. The suffering was real, but it was also building something. The cold furnace produces no steel. Remember this, the truth that inverts everything. We have cleared the ground. We have seen the lie for what it is, understood the compounding cost of avoidance, and recognized that the furnace we flee is the very instrument of our transformation. Now we must build, construct the philosophical architecture upon which a new relationship with suffering can rest. Here, then, is the truth that inverts everything. Suffering is not the price of victory, it is the substance of which victory is made. You must understand the full weight of this insight. Most people imagine suffering as the cost of a ticket, an unpleasant payment that secures admission to some pleasant destination. They endure the pain of education for the reward of credentials. They suffer through the difficult years of building for the eventual comfort of success. They pay now so they may enjoy later. This is how nearly everyone conceives the relationship between suffering and achievement. They are wrong, completely, fundamentally wrong. Suffering is not the price of victory. It is the actual material from which victory is constructed. The capacity to suffer well is not a prerequisite for achievement, but achievement's essential core. The general who cannot endure setbacks cannot command. His capacity to suffer reversals is not separate from his capacity to lead. It is that capacity. The artist who cannot bear criticism cannot create. Her ability to endure rejection is not the price of her art, but its very substance. The parent who cannot sacrifice cannot raise children. The willingness to suffer for them is not preliminary to love, but constitutive of it. Let me illustrate this from my own experience. After the catastrophe of 1915, I was removed from the Admiralty, stripped of influence, made an object of public scorn. The suffering was profound, not merely wounded pride, but genuine grief for the men who died and the opportunity lost. What was I to do? The easy path was withdrawal, from politics, from public life, from the arena where such wounds are inflicted. Many counseled exactly this, but something in me understood, though I could not then have articulated it clearly, that this suffering was not incidental to my purpose but essential to it. The capacity to bear responsibility for failure, to endure public opprobrium while maintaining private conviction, to continue believing in myself when the world offered only evidence of my inadequacy, these were not merely burdens to survive, they were capacities to develop. So I went to the trenches, and there, amid the daily teaching of mortality, something strange occurred. The suffering did not merely pass, it deposited something. Capabilities I had feared destroyed were restored, indeed, were deepened. I emerged not despite the suffering but through it, carrying something that would be needed in 1940 and beyond. This is the inversion you must grasp. When difficulty arrives, stop asking the victim's question, "Why is this happening to me?" Ask instead the builder's question, "What is this building in me?" The shift seems small. You are not paying for victory, you are constructing it. And suffering is the material. How character is actually forged. If suffering is the substance of victory, then what exactly is it building? What is this product that can only be forged in pain's furnace? The answer is character, and character, I have long believed, is destiny. The qualities of soul determine the outcome of events more surely than material circumstance. I have seen this proven repeatedly across decades of public life. Two men possess identical training, identical intelligence, identical opportunity. Yet when crisis arrives, one rises and the other breaks. What distinguishes them? Not natural gift, not fortunate circumstance, not superior resources. Character distinguishes them, and character is the crystallized residue of suffering well endured. You must understand the mechanism. Character cannot be taught, inherited, or purchased. It can only be forged, and there is only one forge: difficulty accepted and transformed. The pampered princeling rarely develops the qualities that command loyalty or achieve great deeds, not because ease corrupts, though it can, but because ease never activates the forge. Without heat and pressure, there is no transformation. Consider what happens when a man endures genuine trial successfully. He does not merely survive, he deposits something in his soul's account. Fortitude grows stronger, like a muscle exercised. Perspective deepens. Clarity increases about what truly matters, for pain's instruction is brutally honest. The man who has weathered one storm possesses actual capacity that the untested man lacks, not theoretical capability, but real reserves available for withdrawal when the next crisis arrives. I observed this most clearly in the officers with whom I served. Some had known only comfort before the war. Others had endured previous difficulty. When shells began to fall, the difference was stark. Those who had suffered previously had something to draw upon, reserves deposited through prior endurance. Those who had been sheltered found their accounts empty at the moment of supreme demand. Character had been built in the first through accumulated difficulty. The second had made no deposits because no deposits had been demanded. This accumulative nature is essential to grasp. Each genuine trial successfully navigated adds to the reservoir. The deposits compound over time, building capacity that the conscious mind may not recognize. Then comes the supreme test, the crisis that demands more than you thought you possessed, and you discover reserves you did not know you had. Where did they come from? From every difficulty previously endured and transformed. The account was richer than you knew. In May 1940, when I became Prime Minister, Britain faced her darkest hour. The continent had fallen. Invasion seemed imminent. Our position appeared hopeless. Yet I found within myself capacities I did not know existed, a sustained ability to endure pressure that I could not have manufactured in the moment. Those capacities came from somewhere, from Gallipoli's disgrace, from the wilderness years' isolation, from every difficulty endured across 6 decades of struggle. I was drawing on deposits made through a lifetime of accepted suffering. You are making deposits now, or failing to make them. Each difficulty you face genuinely, without flight or complaint, adds to your reserves. Each difficulty you avoid is a deposit not made, a strengthening foregone. Character is destiny. And character is forged only in the fire you would rather flee. The reserves you do not know you have, we have established that character is forged through accepted difficulty, that each trial successfully navigated deposits something in the soul's account. Now we must examine a truth both comforting and demanding. These deposits accumulate across years and decades, building reserves that the conscious mind may not recognize until the moment of supreme test. I speak from direct experience. In May 1940, when I became Prime Minister, Britain faced circumstances that might have broken any man. France was falling. The armies of tyranny swept across Europe with a speed that paralyzed comprehension. Our expeditionary force was trapped at Dunkirk. Invasion appeared not merely possible but imminent, and upon my shoulders fell the responsibility for a nation's survival. Where did I find the capacity to bear such weight? I can tell you with certainty, I did not manufacture it in the moment. No man could. That capacity was drawn from reserves deposited across 65 years of living. Reserves I did not fully know existed until I needed them. Consider what had gone into that account. Gallipoli's catastrophe had deposited the capacity to bear responsibility for failure without being destroyed by it. The wilderness years of the 1930s, when I warned of dangers that no one wished to hear, had deposited the capacity to maintain conviction against overwhelming dismissal. Every battle faced, every crisis weathered, every loss endured had added something to the reservoir. When the supreme demand came, the reservoir was full. This is the accumulative principle you must grasp. Fortitude strengthens with exercise, precisely as a muscle does. The man who has endured one storm possesses capacity the untested man lacks, not theoretical capability but actual reserves, available for withdrawal when circumstances demand. Each genuine trial adds to the account. The deposits compound over time, silently, often unnoticed, building strength that reveals itself only when strength is desperately required. But here is the sobering corollary. The man who has avoided difficulty has made no deposits. His account is empty. When crisis arrives demanding withdrawal, he reaches for reserves that do not exist. This is why comfortable lives so often collapse at the first serious test, not because their possessors lack intelligence or good intentions, but because they never built the reserves that crisis requires. You must understand the practical implication. The small difficulties you face today are not merely inconveniences to be minimized, they are opportunities for deposit. The frustration you handle without complaint, the setback you process without self-pity, the disappointment you absorb without broadcasting, each is a small deposit that accumulates toward reserves you may desperately need tomorrow. I did not know, in 1915, that I was building reserves for 1940. I did not know, during the lonely years of warning, that I was developing capacities that would be required when warning became reality. The deposits were made in darkness. Their value was revealed in crisis. You are making deposits now, or failing to make them. The choice is yours. But understand this: when your moment of supreme demand arrives, you will draw upon what you have deposited. Nothing more. Acceptance that does not surrender. We have built the philosophical architecture. Now we must learn to live within it. The first practical step in suffering well is the shift from avoidance to acceptance. But acceptance must not be confused with resignation, and this distinction is absolutely crucial. I have observed two responses to difficulty that appear similar but produce opposite results. The first says, "This is hard, and I shall endure it while continuing toward my aim." The second says, "Life is suffering, therefore nothing matters, therefore why bother?" Both might call themselves acceptance, only the first actually is. Resignation is avoidance wearing philosophical clothes. The man who declares that nothing matters has not made peace with suffering. He has found a sophisticated method of fleeing from it. By refusing to care about outcomes, he inoculates himself against disappointment. But he also inoculates himself against achievement, against meaning, against everything that makes life worth living. His resignation is cowardice dressed as wisdom. True acceptance is entirely different. It acknowledges that suffering is real, that more suffering lies ahead, and that worthy aims nevertheless deserve pursuit. It says, "Yes, this hurts. Yes, more pain is coming. And yes, I continue, because the goal merits the cost." During the Blitz, I observed both patterns among the people of London. Some accepted the bombing with genuine fortitude. They went to the shelters, endured the nights, and emerged each morning to carry on their work and their lives. Their acceptance was active, engaged, defiant. Others displayed a counterfeit acceptance, a fatalistic shrug suggesting that nothing mattered anyway, that the bombs would fall regardless, that effort was pointless. The first group rebuilt. The second merely waited. The test of genuine acceptance is not what you say, but what you do. If you continue pursuing worthy aims despite the pain, you have accepted. If you abandon aims to avoid pain, you have fled. If you stop caring about aims altogether, you have resigned, which is merely flight with a philosophical justification. Let me offer a formula you can apply when difficulty arrives. Yes, this hurts. Yes, more pain lies ahead. Yes, I continue. Speak it aloud if necessary. The first phrase acknowledges reality. No pretense that pain is pleasant or easy. The second phrase refuses false optimism. No pretense that the difficulty will quickly pass. The third phrase commits to action despite both truths. This is not positive thinking or wishful hoping. It is clear-eyed acknowledgement of difficulty combined with resolute determination to persist. The pain remains real, but its meaning changes entirely when met with acceptance rather than flight. Acceptance that surrenders is not acceptance at all. Remember this when the temptation to resign presents itself wearing the mask of wisdom. The counterfeit that wastes suffering there is a counterfeit version of endurance that wastes the very suffering it appears to embrace. I speak of performative suffering, the announcement of pain, the broadcasting of difficulty, the constant accounting of grievances presented for sympathy rather than transformation. This counterfeit looks like endurance but produces nothing of value. I learned to recognize this pattern during my wilderness years of the 1930s. I could have spent those decades lamenting my exclusion from power, cataloging the ingratitude of those who rejected my warnings, rehearsing my grievances to anyone who would listen. Indeed, I was not entirely free of such indulgence. I confess it openly. But the productive work lay elsewhere, continuing to study the gathering dangers, preparing speeches no one wished to hear, developing capacities that would be needed if circumstances changed. The man who merely complains about suffering has made pain his master. The man who suffers silently while working toward his purpose has made pain his servant. The difference appears subtle. It is actually vast. Consider what happens when you announce your difficulties to the world. You convert potential transformation into attention. You trade the possibility of internal development for the immediate currency of sympathy. The exchange feels satisfying in the moment. Someone has acknowledged your pain, validated your struggle. But what have you gained that endures? Sympathy spends immediately. Character compounds indefinitely. This is not to say that support has no value. Genuine connection with those who encourage action has its place. But there is a vast difference between seeking support that enables you to continue and seeking sympathy that substitutes for continuation. The first mobilizes energy, the second dissipates it. The counterfeit reveals itself through several signs. Watch for frequent announcement of difficulty, as though pain unspoken somehow doesn't count. Notice the detailed accounting of grievances, the careful maintenance of records proving how much you have endured. Observe the subtle competition with others' suffering, the need to establish that your burden is heavier, your path steeper, your trials more severe. These are the marks of performance rather than genuine endurance. The genuine article is quieter. It processes pain internally rather than broadcasting it externally. It extracts lessons without demanding acknowledgement. It moves forward without requiring approval. The suffering still hurts, often more than the performed variety, because no sympathy dilutes it, but it builds something that the counterfeit never can. Ask yourself honestly, am I suffering or am I performing suffering? The answer determines whether your pain will transform you or merely exhaust you. Purpose, as the alchemist's stone, we have established that suffering must be accepted genuinely rather than resigned to passively, and that genuine endurance is internal rather than performed. Now we arrive at the element that transmutes suffering from burden into building material: purpose. Random suffering, the meaningless cruelty of accident or malice, refines nothing and serves no end. A man struck by misfortune without context merely suffers. He does not grow. But suffering, in pursuit of a worthy aim, has an entirely different character. Purpose is the alchemist's stone that converts base pain into golden capacity. I have observed this transmutation countless times. Consider two artists facing identical rejection, their work dismissed, their talent questioned, their efforts deemed worthless. The first, whose purpose is merely to be admired, experiences pure wound. The rejection confirms his worthlessness. Each failure diminishes him. The second, whose purpose is mastery of his craft, experiences something quite different. The same rejection becomes information. What did not work? What must change? What remains to be learned? His suffering feeds his purpose rather than contradicting it. The mechanism is not mysterious. Purpose provides context for pain. The soldier in training understands that exhaustion serves his preparation for battle. The same exhaustion without purpose would be merely miserable. The mother enduring sleepless nights understands that her sacrifice serves her child's flourishing. The same sleeplessness without meaning would be torture. Purpose does not remove pain. Let us be clear on this, but it utterly transforms pain's significance. Here is a truth you must grasp. The greater the purpose, the more suffering it will require, and the more that suffering will accomplish. Small purposes make small demands and yield small transformations. Great purposes demand great endurance, and they produce great capacity in those who meet their demands. This is why the man who seeks merely personal comfort finds that even small pains loom large, while the man who serves a cause beyond himself discovers that even great suffering becomes bearable. During the darkest days of the war, I drew constantly upon this principle. Each sacrifice demanded of the British people was connected explicitly to the purpose we served: the survival of civilization, the defeat of tyranny, the preservation of liberty for generations yet unborn. The suffering was real and terrible. But it was suffering for something, not merely suffering, and that distinction made all the difference. You must examine your current difficulties with this question: what purpose does this suffering serve? If you cannot answer, find an answer, or recognize that you may be enduring damage rather than building capacity. Purpose is not optional. It is the essential ingredient that transmutes lead into gold. Without purpose, suffering is merely suffering. With purpose, suffering becomes transformation. What true love actually demands: we have examined suffering's role in individual development, how it forges character, how it must be accepted without resignation, how purpose transmutes it into capacity. Now we must extend this understanding beyond the self to the realm of human relationship, for the wisdom of suffering well applies, with particular force, to love. True love, I have observed across decades of life, is not the provision of comfort. It is the willingness to suffer alongside and for another. This truth contradicts the popular conception which imagines love as the source of pleasure and pain as love's enemy. But examine any genuine love, the love of parent for child, of friend for friend, of those bound in true marriage, and you will find suffering at its core. The parent who truly loves does not spare the child all difficulty. Such sparing would cripple rather than protect, producing an adult incapable of meeting the world's inevitable demands. The loving parent prepares the child to face difficulty successfully, which requires allowing difficulty to be faced, enduring the pain of watching one's child struggle, resisting the impulse to remove every obstacle from the path. This is suffering for the beloved's sake. It is love's actual expression. I have observed marriages of apparent compatibility that collapsed at the first serious trial, and marriages of apparent discord that endured through the most terrible storms. The difference was always the same. The fragile marriages were built on mutual provision of comfort, each partner seeking ease in the other. When ease became unavailable, as it inevitably does, the foundation crumbled. The enduring marriages were built on mutual willingness to suffer together, to face difficulty as a unit, to endure for and with each other whatever might come. The deepest human bonds are forged not in pleasure but in shared ordeal. This is why friendships formed in crisis so often outlast friendships formed in comfort. This is why the comrades of war maintain connections that peacetime acquaintances cannot match. Shared suffering welds souls together in ways that shared pleasure cannot approach. Consider this truth for your own relationships, which have been tested by genuine difficulty endured together. These are your deepest bonds, whether you recognize it or not, which have known only comfort and ease. These remain shallow, however pleasant, for they have never been through the fire that reveals and strengthens what is genuine. Do not, I caution you, manufacture difficulty to test your bonds. That is manipulation, not wisdom. But when difficulty arrives naturally, as it always does, recognize it as opportunity. The crisis that could divide you can instead weld you together. The suffering that could isolate can instead connect. Everything depends upon whether both parties understand that enduring together is love's actual expression, not love's interruption. True love demands suffering. Those unwilling to suffer are incapable of love. This is simply how love works. Duty and the acceptance of necessary pain. We have seen how the wisdom of suffering well transforms our capacity for love. Now we must extend this understanding to a realm even broader, the domain of duty. For duty, rightly understood, is inseparable from suffering, and the man who flees suffering necessarily betrays duty. Duty is that which we owe, to family, to profession, to community, to principle. It is not optional when convenient and discardable when costly. Duty, by its very nature, demands what is difficult rather than what is easy, what costs us rather than what benefits us, what requires sacrifice rather than what offers gain. The man who accepts duty, therefore, necessarily accepts suffering. There is no other way. I have observed this truth across decades of public service. When war came in 1914, young men across Britain understood immediately that duty would require suffering, potentially the ultimate suffering. And they rose to meet it, not because they sought death, but because they understood that some obligations transcend personal comfort. The cause may have been imperfectly understood, the execution tragically flawed, but the fundamental comprehension was correct. Duty claims us, and that claim is paid in the currency of accepted difficulty. Consider what happens when duty suffering is refused. The parent who will not endure the difficulty of discipline produces a child unprepared for reality. The soldier who will not endure the hardship of training fails his comrades when battle comes. The leader who will not bear the burden of unpopular decision betrays those who depend upon his judgment. In each case, the flight from suffering is simultaneously the betrayal of duty. The two cannot be separated. This is why comfortable ages tend to produce fewer heroes, not because heroic capacity is lacking in comfortable times, but because the conditions that develop and demonstrate heroism are absent. Duty necessarily involves suffering. Where suffering is systematically avoided, duty atrophies. The muscle that is never exercised wastes away. Examine your own life with this question. What duties do you hold? To family, to profession, to community, to the principles you profess to believe. For each duty, ask further, what suffering does this duty currently demand? And then, with ruthless honesty, am I paying that price or am I evading it? You will likely find, as most do, that certain sufferings have been avoided through elaborate justification. The difficult conversation was postponed because the timing wasn't right. The unpopular stand was not taken because the moment wasn't opportune. The sacrifice was deferred because circumstances would surely improve. These justifications feel reasonable. They are, in fact, duty's betrayal wearing reason's clothes. I do not say this to condemn. I say it to clarify. Duty and suffering are bound together. Accept one, accept the other. Refuse one, refuse both. There is no middle path, however earnestly we might seek one. Honor is nothing more than duty accepted, the determination to pay what obligation demands, even when payment is painful. Dishonor is duty evaded when its cost becomes clear. Between these two, each of us chooses daily, in matters large and small. Choose honor, accept the suffering that duty demands. This is how character is proven and civilization is preserved. When civilizations refuse the furnace, what is true for individuals is true for peoples. A civilization that cannot suffer collectively cannot defend itself, cannot build for posterity, cannot maintain the institutions that require sacrifice for their preservation. We must now examine this truth, for its implications extend far beyond the personal. I watched France fall in 1940 with anguish but not with complete surprise. For years I had observed in her political class an unwillingness to face unpleasant truths, an expectation that comfort was somehow owed, a fatal belief that difficulty could be negotiated away. When I spoke of danger, French ministers spoke of détente. When I urged preparation, they urged patience. The entire apparatus of government seemed designed to avoid the suffering that clear-eyed assessment would have required. And then the test came. The reserves were not there, not because Frenchmen lacked courage, for they did not, but because too few had been willing to pay the smaller prices that would have prevented the larger catastrophe. The political class had sought comfort. The nation paid with conquest. Britain endured because in that crucial hour sufficient numbers of her people understood that victory would require suffering, and accepted the bargain. Not gladly, no sane person welcomes pain, but deliberately, with clear comprehension of what was at stake and what would be demanded. The capacity to suffer collectively, built through shared history and shared sacrifice, proved the difference between survival and subjugation. This is the civilizational principle you must grasp. Successful societies generate comfort, and comfort erodes the capacity that generated success. This is the cycle that has destroyed every great civilization. Not invasion from without, though that often delivers the final blow, but softness from within that makes invasion possible. Rome did not fall to barbarians alone. Rome fell because Romans had forgotten how to suffer for Rome. The signs of civilizational softness are easily recognized. Watch for political discourse that promises painless solutions to difficult problems. Observe cultural celebration of ease over achievement, comfort over contribution. Notice popular outrage at any suggestion of sacrifice, as though sacrifice itself were an injustice rather than a price. Mark well the leaders who tell people what they wish to hear rather than what they need to know. These are the signs of a society forgetting how to endure. You are part of your civilization's capacity for necessary suffering. Your individual willingness to face hard truths, to accept necessary difficulty, to endure without complaint. This contributes to the collective reservoir from which your society will draw when crisis comes. And crisis always comes. Ask yourself honestly, am I contributing to my society's strength or its softness? Do I demand painless solutions, or am I willing to accept my share of necessary difficulty? The civilization is made of individuals. Its capacity is the sum of theirs. When civilizations refuse the furnace, they lose the capacity to survive it. History teaches no lesson more clearly. What suffering reveals about existence, we have traced the wisdom of suffering well from individual practice through relationship and duty to civilizational survival. Now we must ascend to the highest perspective and ask what suffering reveals about the nature of existence itself. If life without suffering would be life without genuine achievement, without tested character, without deep relationship, without duty performed, then suffering is not life's defect, but its instrument. The universe that permits pain is not thereby proven cruel, but rather serious, engaged in the business of creating something that matters and demanding of its conscious creatures a commensurate engagement. Consider the evidence. The greatest works of human creation have emerged not from ease, but from struggle. Beethoven composed his Ninth Symphony in deafness, that triumphant affirmation of joy created by a man who could not hear a single note of its performance. Dante wrote his Divine Comedy in exile, banished from the Florence he loved, wandering from court to court, never to return home. Milton dictated Paradise Lost in blindness, seeing with inner vision what his eyes could no longer perceive. In each case, suffering did not diminish the Creator. It activated capacities that comfort would have left dormant. The pressure that might have crushed, instead, produced diamonds. This pattern appears too consistently to be coincidental. The universe seems to operate on this principle. Depth requires difficulty, and meaning emerges from struggle. I do not pretend to understand this fully. Philosophy has wrestled with suffering's meaning since thought began, and I am no philosopher. But I have lived long enough and observed closely enough to recognize a pattern. Those who engage suffering most honestly tend to produce lives of greatest depth, while those who flee suffering most successfully tend to produce lives of greatest shallowness. This suggests something profound about existence itself. A universe that demanded nothing would be a universe in which nothing mattered. That ours demands suffering suggests not cosmic cruelty, but cosmic seriousness. The raw material for meaning is being refined through difficulty, and we are invited to participate in that refining. When difficulty arrives, then, we face a choice not merely practical but philosophical. We can interpret our suffering as evidence of a hostile or indifferent universe, asking, "Why me?" in tones of victimhood. Or we can interpret our suffering as evidence of a serious universe that demands our engagement, asking, "What is being required of me?" in tones of participation. The first interpretation produces bitterness and paralysis. The second produces depth and meaning. The suffering is identical. The interpretation transforms its significance entirely. I choose the second interpretation, not because I can prove it true, but because I have observed its fruits across a lifetime. Those who engage suffering as meaningful produce meaningful lives. Those who flee suffering as meaningless produce lives that confirm their assumption. What suffering reveals about existence is finally what we choose to see. The victory within, the defeat we approach now the truth that liberates. The capacity to endure is itself a victory, perhaps the most fundamental victory of all, for all other victories depend upon it. The man who can suffer and continue has already triumphed over the forces that would defeat him. Everything else is consequence and detail. This understanding inverts the common conception entirely. Most people define victory by outcomes: the battle won, the goal achieved, the opponent vanquished. By this definition, victory depends upon factors largely beyond our control. Circumstances must align, fortune must favor, others must respond as we hope they will. Victory becomes hostage to the external world. But there is another definition, truer and more liberating. Victory is not the outcome that follows endurance, but the endurance itself. The soldier who holds his position against overwhelming force has already won the only victory that was his to win, regardless of whether reinforcements arrive or the line eventually breaks. The outcome was determined by forces beyond him. The victory was determined by his response to those forces. That victory no enemy could take from him. I learned this truth through repeated experience of apparent defeat transformed by continued engagement. After Gallipoli, defeat seemed complete. After the wilderness years, relevance seemed impossible. After Dunkirk, survival seemed unlikely. In each case, the conventional assessment pointed toward surrender. Reasonable surrender, justified surrender, surrender that any sensible person would understand. But I did not surrender. Not from certainty of success. I had no such certainty. Not from guarantee of vindication. None was offered. I continued because continuing was the only victory available to me. And in continuing, I preserved the possibility of everything that followed. This is the liberation you must grasp. You cannot control outcomes, circumstances, fortune, the responses of others. These lie largely beyond your power. But you can control response. You can choose in every moment whether to continue or surrender. And that choice, the choice to endure, is itself victory, regardless of what follows. When you understand this truth, anxiety about results loosens its grip. You do your work, accept your suffering, and let outcomes fall where they may, knowing that the victory of endurance is already yours if you choose to claim it. Success may follow. It often does when endurance is genuine. But success is not the victory. Endurance is. In every difficulty, ask, what is the victory available to me here? The answer is always the same. Continued engagement, refusal to break, endurance through whatever comes. This victory is always possible, regardless of circumstance. Claim it. No external force can defeat a man who has made endurance his victory. He can be killed, ruined, disgraced, but not defeated. Defeat requires surrender, and surrender is always his choice. The flame that must be tended, we have arrived at the end of our inquiry. But the end of inquiry is the beginning of practice. Understanding can be achieved in a moment of illumination. Embodiment is the work of a lifetime. The flame we have kindled together must now be tended by you alone, across all the days and years that remain to you. I close not with moments of triumph, but with the daily discipline that made such moments possible. The morning hours spent writing in bed while others slept, preparing for demands not yet visible. The afternoon walks at Chartwell that restored perspective when difficulty pressed too closely. The evening hours of study that deposited knowledge into reserves I would later need. These quotidian choices, accumulated across decades, are where embodiment actually occurs. The great crises found me ready not because I possessed exceptional gifts, others possessed gifts far greater, but because I had maintained the daily practice of engagement through countless small difficulties. The flame had been tended. When the wind rose, it did not go out. This is the practice I commend to you. Each morning before the day's demands begin, recommit to the stance we have examined. Acceptance without resignation, endurance without performance, purpose that transmutes pain into capacity. Say it simply. Today I accept what comes. I endure. I engage. This brief recommitment maintains the flame between one difficulty and the next. Do not wait for great crises to practice what we have learned together. Use daily frustrations as your training ground. The irritation of delay, the disappointment of setback, the annoyance of obstruction. These are not merely inconveniences, but opportunities. Handle them without complaint, extract their lessons without broadcasting your pain, and you make small deposits that accumulate toward reserves you may one day desperately need. When you fail, and you will fail, I failed countless times, do not abandon the practice. Return to it. The flame does not go out in a single moment of weakness. It goes out through sustained neglect. Tend it, and it survives your failures. There is no graduation from this school, no point at which you have mastered suffering and may rest. There is only deepening practice across years and decades, each difficulty an opportunity, each endurance a deposit, each day another chance to tend the flame. Accept this and be patient with yourself. The goal is not perfection but persistence. Never give in. Never, 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 never. In nothing, great or small, large or petty. Never give in except to convictions of honor and good sense. And when the suffering comes, as it will, receive it not as an enemy but as an instructor, not as an obstacle but as an opportunity, not as the price of victory but as victory itself in its essential form. This is what I know. This is what I have learned. This is what I invite you to discover. The flame has been kindled. It is now yours to tend.